are joining us for our first Business Insights, which is going to be a series of 4 events we have every year with the intent to partner a faculty member who's doing important cutting-edge research with one or more industry partners who also have good insights to provide on that topic. And we're starting with a great program this morning. I want to point out the fact that the webinar is being recorded, that you can also enable the closed captions by hitting the live transcript button on the bottom of your screen. The format today is, after we have an introduction and opening remarks from my colleague Antonio, both of our panelists will talk, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And I'd ask you to enter your questions into the Q&A chat, or in the Q&A button, on the Q&A button, and we'll get to those as we can. We have about 200 folks registered today from all over the country. We're just really thrilled about that. Folks from industry and academia and students and a variety of other kinds of folks. My name is Scott Dawson. I'm the dean here in the business school. And to get us started, I'd like to introduce to you our Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion, Antonio Ferris, who comes to us he's the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as I mentioned, comes to us from University of Florida, where he had a similar role, has a long background in the area, a huge level of expertise and passion he brings to it, and we're thrilled to have him here at CU Denver and with us this morning to kick off the program. Antonio?
Thank you, Scott. Oh, and by the way, I just got a text from the Lorax saying he wants his plant back. So, good morning, colleagues. This is a really opportune moment for us here, wherever you're sort of piling in from around the nation and around the globe. I really want to say that as CU Denver evolves into an equity serving institution and really focusing on that word serving, we could not be more fortunate than to have our esteemed colleagues here today. The dialogue today around the intersection of religion and gender, the wage gap, is not only a national, but it's a global concern, particularly during the last 19 months, where COVID has created the perfect storm of inequities for women. And women of color in particular, leaving the working economy at alarming rates. The work is highly adaptable, right? And the concepts that you're going to listen to today are highly adaptable to our current reality here at CU Denver. So I encourage you to sort of make that transition into what we're discussing into the everyday, both of the classroom and our work environment. We're doubly excited to hear from Kristi Lamar, who's the managing director at Deloitte. Unless you've been hiding under a rock, you need to be aware that Deloitte is at the forefront of pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion from both their firm, their clients, and their communities. They have a very visible commitment that has been outlined in their 2021 transparency report, which I encourage you to read in detail and take note of. In addition, I would highly encourage you to screen Kristi's salient and timely video on the DEI imperative. Again, none of this is a standalone. When we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, we're talking about class, we're talking about all sorts of systems that in some way or another, unless we fully understand them as a complexity and intersectional sort of oppression, we're not going to get to the solution sets. So again, I am incredibly thankful that Scott, that you, Michaela, behind the scenes, have brought this together. Traci, Kristi, I look forward to hearing the discussion and really taking this as the on-ramp into us becoming what is truly going to be a monumental task for us of becoming an equity serving institution. So Scott, I pass it back to you or whoever is emceeing it right now.
Thank you, Antonio, for those nice welcoming remarks. And I also want to echo our appreciation for our partnership with Deloitte and our admiration for their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this morning, Traci Sitzmann, our faculty member, esteemed faculty member, will be talking first, followed by Kristi, and I'd like to do introductions for both of them to get us started. So Traci Sitzmann is a professor of management and one-year MBA research fellow. Her research focuses on pressing issues in society, including religion and the gender wage gap, the effects of the gender wage gap on firm performance, and optimizing firms' diversity and inclusion strategies. Her research has been published in leading academic journals, and including the Academy of Management, Journal of Applied Psychology, and Psychology Bulletin. Her research has won multiple awards and has been covered by a variety of media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and Forbes. In addition to serving the university, Traci provides consulting services, including examining the validity of the Myers-Briggs indicator and providing organizations with guidance on enhancing the effectiveness of technology-delivered training. Prior to joining the University of Colorado, Denver, Traci worked as a consultant for the Department of Defense. Kristi Lamar is the managing director, and serves on Monitor Deloitte's leadership team, focused on strategic growth, and is the US leader for women in technology. She has significant experience in advising the C-suite, especially CIOs and technology executives, to enable them to create lasting enterprise value and manage the challenges and changes in business technology and their executive roles. She has a 20-year track record of developing and delivering successful business technology programs for the leaders of the global enterprise. In her role as digital director for Deloitte's Executive Accelerators team, she designs insights and experiences that help executives solve complex business challenges. Kristi is passionately committed to helping to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion for our people, firm, and communities, and is a respected thought leader and vocal advocate on the topic. Traci, take it away.
So I am a pretty firm believer that some topics should be off limits in a Zoom call with 200 strangers. And at the top of my list would be religion, sex, money, and politics. And yet I'm coming to you today, hoping you're going to overcome the awkwardness of the topics we're about to discuss, because we are going to discuss the intersection of all of these things. Now I'm calling this the hidden cost of prayer. And it's research that I conducted with Elizabeth Campbell, and we published it just this month in the Academy of Management Journal. Now think about what determines people's values and behaviors. What we know is that religion is one of the most pervasive forces for determining people's values, and it has this effect all around the world. Yet despite the fact that it's so pervasive, there have only been 2 published management articles in the last decade in top-tier outlets that focused on the intersectionality between religion and business. Now, both of them told us that religion is a benign and positive force, and it encourages people to work harder because of their Islamic and their Protestant work ethic. So they encouraged firms to show their support for diversity and inclusion by increasing this intersectionality between religion and business. And what you're seeing here is a lot of firms have taken them up on that. What you see is In-N-Out Burger and Forever 21 print references to the Bible on their packaging material. Tyson employs a chaplain to provide spiritual guidance for their employees. And even Walmart tells us that their financial success is due to God. So notably absent from either of these manuscripts was any discussion of how religion affects gender attitudes. So what I did then is I turned to the religion literature. I looked at what scholars around the world from each of the major world religions are saying about the intersectionality between religion and gender. And scholars unanimously agree that religion imposes a gender hierarchy. And men are serving in a dominant role in this hierarchy, whereas women are seen as more submissive. And what I'm proposing then is this differentiation based on gender, where we prioritize men, may then translate into a larger gender wage gap in more religious societies. Now check this out. So in our most religious countries around the world, women are only receiving 46% of men's wages. So the gender wage gap is 29 percentage points greater in our most than our least religious countries. And this also translates to our 50 United States. What you're seeing here is that the gender wage gap is 8 percentage points greater in our most than our least religious states. Now, what I find troubling is when you're talking to people about the gender wage gap, many of us have become complacent. People say it's trending in the right direction, so if we just sit back and do nothing, we're eventually going to get there. But what our data shows is whether the gender wage gap is closing over time is contingent upon the religiosity of the state in which you live. So in our most secular states, we're going to get to the point where men and women are paid equally in 28 years if we continue with the current trend. Whereas in our most religious states, it is going to be 109 years before men and women are paid equally. Now, when I was doing this research, a lot of people were still pushing back. You know, so far the results that I've showed you are not causal, they're correlational. So next what I did was I went into the laboratory setting. And the reason that we do things in a laboratory is because it allows us to manipulate something in order to determine a cause and effect relationship. So half of my participants are presented with a corporate mission statement that focuses on God, borrowed it from Chick-fil-A. The other half of my participants are given a secular mission statement. So a corporate mission statement that does not focus on God. And then after that, they allocate wages to employees. And what we're seeing is we only had a gender wage gap when we presented our participants with the religious corporate mission statement. In fact, in our secular culture, women were paid slightly more than men. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that this effect applies across all the major world religions. So by major world religions, I mean Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, folk, Islam, and I think I missed one, and Hinduism. And what we see is the relationship between religion and the gender wage gap does not differ across the major world religions, such that this effect applies across world religions. So next, I wanted to know why. You know, what is it about religion that's causing this effect on the gender wage gap? So once again, I turned to my scholars that are studying religion and gender. And I looked across all these major world religions, and scholars agreed that there are 3 domains in which we differentiate based on gender in religious cultures. So the first area is social domains. In our religious culture, what we see is the man is supposed to be the provider for his family. He's the breadwinner, whereas the woman is supposed to be in charge of reproducing. And after she reproduces, she's supposed to spend her time caring for her family. So we're proposing then this differentiation of social domains may hold women back such that if they're expected to put their family first, they may not be able to succeed in lucrative professional careers. So next I pulled data across our 140 countries around the world and our 50 United States. And what we see is that the more religious the culture is, the more on average children per woman, and that women are less likely to be represented in the workforce in a religious society, and that women are likely to be denied access to abortion in more religious societies, which is pretty important because you need control over your reproductive health in order to be able to prioritize your career. What's so interesting is these areas of gender differentiation explain the effect of religion on the gender wage gap. Now, the other areas in which the next area in which we differentiate based on gender is sexuality. Men are permitted much greater sexual freedom than women in religious cultures, whereas women are seen as a sexual object. And the way in which you can see this is in our religious cultures, women are regulated in terms of their clothing and in terms of whether they are not they're allowed to have sex, especially whether they can have sex outside the bounds of marriage. Now, the reason you care about this in the workforce is because if you are going to evaluate a woman, you want people to be concentrating on her mental competencies and her contribution to the workplace. And if we are regulating her sexuality, it means that we're not concentrating on the right things, which may mean that people deem her as less worthy of a higher wage in our firms. So the question then becomes, how do you measure this? So we know that in some religions, if a woman reports that she is raped, that she can be held accountable for that if she can now not find male corroborating witnesses. We also know that the religiosity of the society affects whether men are convicted or charged with sexual crimes. So I had to figure out then, how do I get data that tells me whether women are sexually objectified? So the cool thing is, I don't know if you've ever looked at this, but you can turn to Google Trends and it'll tell you what people are searching for online in any culture, so in any state or any country around the world. And it does this relative to all other internet traffic. So it gives you a pretty good idea of what's important to people in a society. And what we're seeing here is the more religious the culture, the more internet traffic related to rape, and the more internet traffic related to pornography. And this sexual objectification of women explains the effect of religion on the gender wage gap. So our third area of gender differentiation is power. Religion proposes that men are supposed to be in positions of power, women are supposed to be submissive. They're supposed to aid their man in his leadership roles. And the easiest way you can see this is in the Christian faith. Our Pope tells us that the door is closed on women who wish to be ordained priests. We're beginning to see across some religious organizations that women are being permitted into lower level leadership roles, but they are not permitted into the upper echelons of any religious organization. And indeed, turning back to my 140 countries in my 50 United States, what I'm seeing is the more religious the society, the less likely women are to be represented on the board of directors. They're less likely to be represented in politics. In some countries, they don't have equality under the law, and they have lower educational attainment, which is pretty important because if you want to be in a position of power, you have to be able to read and represent yourself. And this gender differentiation of power explains the effect of religion on the gender wage gap. Now, what's so critical about this is we are explaining 37% of the variability in the gender wage gap, both in our 50 United States and across countries around the world. So religion then is one of the most pervasive predictors of the gender wage gap across everything that's been identified to date. So I really just don't want to leave you hanging. So next what I did was I went back to my laboratory setting and I figured, I need to figure out what we're going to do about this. So this time, okay, in all of my experimental conditions, everybody sees that Chick-fil-A corporate mission statement focusing on honoring God. But along with that then, I set up 3 experimental conditions to try and mitigate the effect of religion on the gender wage gap. So to block the social domains, I told my participants that both men and women in our firm are required to take parental leave and to be actively involved in their children's lives. Next, I tried to stop sexual objectification. I told my participants that we have a strong sexual harassment policy and we enforce it. And third, in order to have equality and power, I set up a graph where both men and women were equally represented in leadership roles. And what we saw is that we have a gender wage gap when we present people with religious values without requiring equality. But regardless of which of the ways in which I impose values of equality, if I put values of equality alongside religiosity, it negated the effect of religion on the gender wage gap. Now, what I think is so interesting about the gender wage gap literature is it feels a little bit like we're blaming women for the gender wage gap. So when people are talking about this, they say, the reason that women are paid less than men is because women reproduce. And when we reproduce, we take weeks, months, or years off of the workforce. And that it causes women then to accrue less human capital throughout their career span than men, such that that's the predominant explanation of the gender wage gap. But there's also been a recent meta-analysis. So they statistically summarized the job performance of men and women. And what they told us is there is no difference in the job performance of men and women. And in my worldview, if women have less human capital, that should be translating into lower job performance, but it's not. I'm hoping that conversations like we're having today are going to move us towards a world where our pay is determined based on our job performance rather than based on gender. Thank you.
Traci, thank you so much. All right, Kristi.
Awesome. Thanks, Traci, for that. I always get on a soapbox, so it's hard for me not to be on that soapbox for you. Really kind of teed it up perfectly for me in my commentary, because I'm going to talk about really employment gaps that we've got. So hopefully my slides are showing pretty well. And to your point, like we know that there is no fundamental difference in terms of job performance between men and women, yet women continue to be, underemployed and not have equality in the workforce. We've all heard the statistics about what the pandemic has done to women's position in the workforce. More than 5.4 million people have lost their jobs or been completely eliminated since February of 2020 to January of 2021. Like that is crazy. And 2.3 million of these women have left the workforce entirely. And it's for a variety of complicated reasons. And it's not just because of childcare, and it's not just because that job doesn't exist. I think we all read the job report, and I'll talk about it a little bit more, but like there are jobs out there. But why come into a job situation where you're not going to have development opportunities, you're not going to get a chance to have access to leadership, that you're not going to get promoted at the same rate of men? So it can be disheartening. But at the same time, there is opportunity for improvement. My dear competitors at McKinsey, I love them because they do this report every once in a while. They actually just came out with their latest research along with leanin.org that talks about kind of the gains that are happening. And I'm going to have much of this data will have a very focus on corporate America, but it applies. And it absolutely applies to you regardless of where you are at in your career or your education, because it's something that we need to be mindful and watch for. So I look at this data, it's a little bit of the tale of two cities, right? And I guess it's maybe me trying to be a little bit glass half full. So if we look at the change in the last 5 years of women, and we'll just go into the C-suite, like to have a 27% gain is good. It's actually great compared to where we're coming from. But as a total population, it's just fundamentally ridiculous. Like to Traci's point, like we operate, we deliver, and actually there's a lot of data that suggests and actually proves that women are better leaders, that we're more empathetic, that we provide greater work-life balance for our professionals. So to have this disparity continue to propagate, it's just fundamentally ridiculous. But at the same time, we're starting from a place of incredible disparity, and we're moving to the right outcomes. It'll take some time, but the beauty is that the data is actually showing that, especially in the US, we're getting to that level of parity much more quickly than we used to be. I used to think that that in my lifetime, there was never going to be any sort of equality. I'm already in my 40s. They're saying it's going to be 65. So hopefully I live to be like 110 so that my children get to experience this. But at the end of the day, what this does show is that we are moving in the right direction, but we're still not there yet. And we talked a little bit earlier when Antonio was on that women of color even have it worse. And we know that COVID has done a number of things for our society, but what it has done is it's fundamentally shown a light on the opportunity that exists and the problems and how can we start to solve it. So this is going to start to show you a bit of kind of women of color in corporations, right? From entry level all the way up through VP level. And the last data showed you, the difference between men and women, and even women of color and men of color. But what this starts to do is to break it down, because we do have different communities and different populations, and the disparity continues to permeate within those, right? So we see here, as we go up into VP and beyond, and even starting at entry level, there's just not the same opportunity. And there are complications that probably, I'm a white woman that grew up in South Denver. I have a very different experience, but we just know, and data shows that people of color have a complicated situation. Asian women oftentimes are overlooked, and the data shows this, right? Even at entry level, if they're starting at 6 percentage points of that work population, going up into having half of that at the C-suite and VP and above, cutting that in half is just unfortunate. And this happens because oftentimes Asian women are mistaken for each other. So they're actually overlooked for promotions. They are not seen as individuals because people are uncomfortable and they just have a hard time kind of navigating. They don't take the time to slow down. Latina women, hugely complicated. We understand culturally that there are differences. Historically, Latina women have less flexibility in their work. They also have more obligations at home. 45% of Latina women say that they have 5 hours or more a day of personal care that's either childcare or elder care, in addition to their full-time job, that they're just trying to manage. Whereas someone like myself has like the 34% of women say it's 5 hours. And so that disparity is a complicating factor as we start to see opportunities for people to evolve their careers. And, to the point about having, wage parity and closing that wage gap, like we have to fundamentally have women in the roles, and we also have to fight for it. Like this is not just a two-sided coin, like it is so many levers that we need to be cognizant of and pulling and driving for time after time. So, tons of opportunity here, but it's also important to understand like what are the complications that women are actually experiencing in the force as well. To the earlier point that like people, 2.3 million people have just left fundamentally the workforce because why would they want to go back? Oh, sorry, I went the wrong direction. So this gives you a breakdown of what women experience when they're actually in the workforce. And I can tell you, and it's been a little while since I've been in the educational environment, like this happens in all sorts of places. It's not just corporate America. It does happen in classrooms sometimes too, and other places in terms of how we show up. So this shows when women are the only women in the room. And I have, my bio is grossly long, by the way, but a lot of times I've been the only woman in the room. And that is a complicating factor. And then when you are a double only, so let's say, and again, I am a white woman who grew up in Denver, cisgender, but if you're a woman that is, a Latinx heritage or a Black woman, this double only is a continuing complicating factor. So not only are women generally challenged in terms of our competency, we are interrupted more, we're not, asked, people talk over us. Oftentimes, like people talk about our emotional state. Hopefully people stop asking about, oh my gosh, is she having her period? Like that stuff happens, by the way, like it is crazy. But we also know that there are microaggressions that happen. And I think that we need to continue to surface conversations around microaggressions as they happen to women and the other races and ethnicities that we represent. And look at the numbers when you are a double only. It is, to me, egregious to feel like people are speaking over you, that they're surprised that you're able to articulate a thought, that you are, understanding of the problem and you can articulate a difference to it. They just are not given the opportunity. They are talked over, they're left out of, they're just not oftentimes invited to the conversation. So, and I'm going to get into kind of how do we change this? What does this mean? But just the awareness of the complication that women, especially when you're the onlys, are experiencing, we can all show up as allies in the places and spaces that we are to make sure that women do have a voice, to make sure that it's okay to say, I love what Traci said and repeat the exact statistic, because what that does is it reinforces that Traci is confident, she is capable, and we should be listening to her. And it's not talking over her, it's reinforcing what she has to say. So bring that allyship into everything that we do, whether it's your work, whether it's your classroom, whether it's your, your PTO meeting as well. At the same time of having all this complication, we are living in a moment. Antonio mentioned it. I have said for the longest time, like we are living in a moment of change. COVID changed our world in ways that I personally could have never expected. Also, with the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, our world fundamentally changed in the United States. And what it did is it shone a light on the complications that people that I have not personally lived through, but I get to experience the change that we're living through. And so as we go into careers, whether you're coming out of higher ed and going into your first job, or if you're already in your professional career, we are living through change. Today, it is not only just important to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we know that it is fundamentally important. 96% of CEOs say that driving, not just talking about it, that driving diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to their business. We know that it changes outcomes. It changes the outcomes in terms of financial performance. We know that more diverse teams drive innovation that creates competition and disrupts markets. We also know that having an inclusive environment is a talent changer. Like I'm not going to want to go work for an organization where they're not diverse and they're not inclusive. And we're living in a war where we need talented individuals. Organizations that don't live it and breathe it are going to be basically decimated. It's an aggressive word, but they're not going to be able to compete. Also, it's important to know that we can embrace incremental change. I mentioned that in the United States, we show projections of the gender gap improving in the next 65 years. So hopefully I live to be 110 years old, and probably my math is horrible. It's probably more like 120, but I'm old and I can't do math quickly. And it's important to know when we talk about the gender gap, it's about economic opportunity. So the wage gap that we just talked about, it's about educational opportunity, making sure that people of all backgrounds, all geographies, all races, ethnicities have access to education and opportunity. It's also about health and survival and wellness, and also political empowerment. So I know that in the United States, I do think that we live in a world that is a little, well, we're 23rd in the country or in the world in terms of our progress. We have so much more to do. But I think that when we collectively work together, we can actually close this 65 to something much more realistic. Also, this hybrid engagement is a game changer, and it changes things in a variety of ways. Like, we can build community now. Like, to have this webinar where people show up at 8 o'clock Mountain Time on a Wednesday or Tuesday morning is great. Like, this just didn't necessarily happen as much 20 months ago. We also know that we can work and be productive. Like, coming from a professional services firm, COVID was an experiment that we never wanted to take. We never thought that we could be productive sitting in our homes, sitting in Zoom, and we can. And what this means is that as we go seek new jobs, as we bring people into our workplaces, as we build community within our workforces, we can do it in a virtual environment. Geography doesn't have to be as much of a consideration if you're looking for a new job. You can seek employment in other places of our country, or frankly, other places of our world. And we also know, because we've demonstrated productivity, that time zone constraints are less relevant than they ever have been. It doesn't have to be that just because I live in Denver, I need to be up at 6 a.m. to be working with my colleagues on the East Coast. We know that people are productive, and just because we don't see them in our spaces, whether it's in an office or in a Zoom, we know that they're productive. So when we think about women, we think, we talked about the Latinx community. When you need to be able to be with your families, need to care for your children, need to care for your parents, if you have flexibility in your life, you can be more productive. You'd be less likely to leave that job. So this hybrid engagement is absolutely a game changer. And then just returning to work, and like, there's so much demand for talent. The jobs report from from August was incredible. Like, and again, this is very US focused, but this is our audience, right? Like, we know that there are so many jobs out there. We also know that there is scale demand in a variety of places that we never really considered at scale. Like, we certainly know that within healthcare, there are tons of jobs. We also know that in technology, and again, I'm a technologist by trade and by learning, there is so much demand for capability. And as people come into the workforce, you all are technology natives. Like, I grew up on a 386, which nobody even knows what that is. But as technology natives are more comfortable and proficient, having careers that are technology based or use technology to enable are also a game changer. So you might be, any variety of career models, but I have to imagine that technology is a part of that. And the demand for your skills and your aptitude and comfort with technology is absolutely in demand. And we also know that this demand isn't going anywhere. If we look in the key areas, and finance is in there as well, all our organizations need these capabilities, need smart people that are going to be passionate about it and want to learn and continue to grow. So at the end of the day, like, we all have a role, whether it's me sitting at Deloitte where we're hiring all the time, or if you're finishing your education, or you're thinking about what your next step is, we all have a role in this, whether it's being a part of an organization or a person that's demanding change or an ally that's in the space with them. We all have a role in it. And it's not a zero-sum game. I joke with my husband all the time. He kind of jokes about being a white male from Chicago that, he's not going to have as much opportunity. But we certainly know the jobs report shows that there is so much demand for capability in the US right now, that there is plenty of opportunity for everybody. There's plenty of room at the top. We just need to make space for that. So first and foremost, demand equal pay. Ask questions, get uncomfortable. So it's not okay anymore to not have that conversation and just take it. Also, recruit and seek differently. Whether you're an employer that is seeking talent, certainly, like, people go to the big universities and like we come to CU Denver, we need to go out and think about where are people showing up differently and seek them and bring them into our organizations. And I also encourage you to think about different avenues to network in your spaces and places. I'll fully say, like, you can always reach out to me if you're looking for a job. Like, there is always an opportunity. It doesn't have to be the traditional way. Also, think about different paths into careers. We talk a lot about returnships, and knowing that so many women and others have left the workforce, it's a great time to come back into the workforce and come into an environment where you can learn and feel safe. Returnships give opportunity for people to say, you know, maybe I was assembling widgets at this company and now I want to go learn data and AI. And that might seem fundamentally different, but the reality is organizations are seeking that talent, and returnship gives an opportunity for somebody to raise their hand and say, I want to come learn in your environment. I want to come make sure that I'm comfortable here. And at the same time, the organization wants to make sure that they teach you and make you feel comfortable there. So it's different paths into jobs that we just have never really embraced at scale. So be aware of those, look for those. Also, be a role model and find a role model. We talk about mentorship, and it is not an open conversation, like, or an empty kind of promise. Like, mentorship absolutely matters. You don't have to be a woman and mentor a woman. Like, men mentors are so important. We always talk about men as allies. And we can be role models at all levels, whether you're mentoring young girls or young boys to have careers and think about things differently. And by the way, it goes both ways. 46 years old, I have so much to learn from the younger generation. So be a role model to me and to others as well. It goes both ways. Have conversations, get uncomfortable. Also, integrate your life in your work. We always talked about work-life balance, and honestly, that's a joke. And now we live where we work. And so as we have our careers, whether we're looking for new jobs or we're in our current environment, you have to demand it, you have to expect it, and you have to set expectations. It's not okay for people to feel like they can't take a break from Zoom. It's not okay for people to say, I'm going to miss my child's cross-country meet because I had to take a meeting. There is opportunity. Like, COVID created a dialogue that we can feel safe, that we can put our wellness first, so we can put ourselves first, and work is secondary and should give us passion. Also, look for organizations that include inclusion everywhere. And the inclusion comes in a variety of ways, shapes, and forms. Like, the fact that we have closed caption today on the Zoom is a great example of that, right? Like, some people can't hear, and I also know that I talk really fast. So subtle ways that create inclusive environments are very important. Even things, and I'll get use Zoom again, the fact that, like, my pronouns always show up, what it does is it creates a safe place for dialogue that people know that they can come to me. There are a variety of tools. Technology is a great enabler, but inclusion should be in everywhere of an organization. And it's a game changer. And this war on talent, if you're not comfortable being yourself and bringing your authentic self to work, then it's not a place that you should actually be spending time. And truly, it doesn't matter where you're at in your educational or your professional career, you have a voice. You should absolutely use it. You can demand different outcomes, obviously in a very nice way, but you can always show up as an ally for everybody in every space that you're at. So I do think that we're going to change this gap, both gender and pay. It's going to take time. I look forward to a day when we don't have to have these conversations and we're saying, look at the great work that we did. But until then, like, lots of passion here, and super thrilled to get to spend time with you all today.
Thank you, Kristi. Particularly appreciate the encouragement around allyship. It's great for all of us to be able to live into that. Such a great set of presentations, and I want to remind folks to enter their questions into the Q&A function there. There are a couple in there that I'll get to in a second, but I want to ask the first question. I guess we have both age and cohort effects at play here. I think that something is really interesting right now with the traditional college age population age cohort is that it is, in terms of going to college now, 60% of students are female, 40% are male. And I think that's true in more developed countries as well. And I also think about in my previous institution looking at trying to improve the achievement gap, that actually males were worse than even folks from underrepresented groups in general. And so I just wonder what your thoughts are about how, as that moves forward, how that might impact this existing wage gap and how we might see things change in terms of power. Traci, you talked about power and so forth, or other factors.
I mean, it all, like I concluded by talking about, people are saying, women have less human capital, but if you put that extra education in the bucket of they may potentially have more human capital, right? I guess I wish there was a dollar value. Okay, let's say that, Scott, I had to take a year off right now, right? I had a kid or something and I needed time. How much should that cost me? And is it acceptable, right? Like, and until as a society, when we start to put the dollar value and start to actually say, like, how much is that worth? And am I in a field where nothing has really changed in a year? So should it cost me anything? I don't know. I mean, we have to stop assuming that these pay decisions are not entwined with our values.
And I'll pile on to that a little bit too. So, Scott, I think like to your point that like 60 plus percentage or 60% or more people within the space are women, like there will be residual effect to that. But at the same time, organizations are large, and it's easy to talk about large companies, but I think fundamentally everywhere, I'm a part of it, need to make sure that when women are in the workforce, that they're having an experience. So to your point, like it shouldn't cost a woman anything to go have a child, right? And I think about the world, like even between like my children are 12 and 13 years old, like the conversation around parental leave, it continues to evolve, right? It used to be like, oh, you might get 6 weeks, you might get 7, now we know it's 13. But organizations that don't have aggressive parental leave policies and flexibility when you're in the workforce, people aren't going to stay there, right? Like Deloitte now has 26 weeks of parental leave. And by the way, that's for men and women, like, because we know that the world has changed, like roles are starting to change. Have they, is it completely equitable? Not in my house, love my husband, but the world is changing. And so there's so many pieces to it, and they shouldn't have to be like, it shouldn't cost money. It shouldn't take money out of your pocket to have children, to have, frankly, a life outside of your 8 hours a day at work.
Yeah, well put. And I guess to the point in the slide that Traci shared early on, I mean, the current 60-40 is a age cohort. We can't wait 28 years for that impact of that to work itself out. So Karen had a great question. To what extent might norms of pay secrecy in organizations contribute to the gender wage gap? I wonder if religion might play a role in willingness to talk about money or speak up, voice concerns about pay transparency and equity.
So I am looking at how the gender wage gap affects firm performance right now. And I keep getting pushback that norms of pay secrecy means that people are not aware of the gender wage gap. But what my data is telling me that people are dissatisfied with their pay to a greater extent in firms that have a gender wage gap. And that it creates tension among employees when you have this gender wage gap. So I may not be aware of the dollar values placed on Scott, right? I don't know how much exactly he makes, but I think we treat people differently based on the dollar value we have attributed to them, right? And even though that pay might occur behind closed doors, in general, I know whether my colleagues value me, and we know to some extent where we rank in terms of pay. I don't know, Kristi, what do you think?
Oh, I'm afraid Kristi's frozen.
Lauren, I wanted to hear a response. Scott, do you think there's something that when you know people's pay, it's somewhat, you sort of associate their worth to your organization, right? Like,
yeah, how could you not? It's a marker, right? Just the same way a price for a product in the marketplace should reflect, the value of the product. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Kristi, you're back. Do you want to take a shot at that question, or were you?
Yeah, sorry, it cut out. I'm not sure what happened. Good thing I have 2 internet connections at home. That's what comes with being a technologist. So, and I apologize, Tracy, if I repeat what you said and it's not accretive. But one of the things that I think is important is it is important to be transparent, right? And this is not like a point or pat Deloitte on the back, but we went through a year and a half to understand actually what the demographics of our professional force looked like, right? So we didn't track everything in terms of your race, your ethnicity, even your gender in all places. And so what we started by doing is we let people self-ID. And once people were able to self-ID, we were then able to lay that up against compensation, right? And we've actually been very clear to say by level, even by different parts of our business, this is where we're at. Like, is there actual equity there? What it does is it surfaced so many complicated, uncomfortable conversations. But what it did is it made us be very transparent. And we said, look, we have work to do. And we also know that we are not promoting at the same level. And so it's one of those things that you cannot measure, you cannot manage what you don't measure. So we had to get at the data and then be transparent about it. And you have to get very uncomfortable to talk about it, to say, here's where we're at. We have kind of a crappy starting point, but we're committed to changing it, right? That's the way people will do it. And if you're not transparent about it, change is going to be really, really hard. It happens in a vacuum at that point.
Yeah, shining a light on the problems, definitely a great place to start. I just want to ask a follow-on. The new Colorado Equal Pay Act, how's that come into play here?
So I don't have a great answer other than it's extremely important. It's very complicated. Organizations are all navigating it at different speeds. But what it does is it surfaces a conversation that is so important. And I love that Colorado is always out in front of these conversations. And so much more to come is really kind of my answer. I'm sorry, it's kind of weak, but.
That's okay, good, thank you. David had a question. Holding position constant, how much of a wage gap exists between men and women? How does employment in large institutions, businesses, where there are HR policies on equal wages affect the wage gap?
So how much of a wage gap exists? What they've done is they have tracked men and women straight out of college and in the exact same job. And what they've shown is, the wage gap in year 1 is pretty minor, but it slowly accrues over time. And this is before even having kids. So it's not the complicating factors in there. So from day 1, there tends to be this gender wage gap.
Okay, anything to add, Kristi?
I was just going to say, I think that their HR policies and the way that organizations are set up are also set up to protect them to some degree. I think about salary bands and how people come into jobs and they're like, oh, you're in a salary band. And even though you might be doing the exact same job, gender regardless, right? It's very easy for them to say, oh, well, the band is this big, right? So there is some protection built into it. I think it's having very clear, transparent conversations is what is going to change it. But it's going to take a while.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys know the literature on the motherhood penalty and the fatherhood premium, right? So when men have a child, people think because they're the breadwinner, they give them extra wages. Whereas when women have a child, they give her a pay cut, relative to women who are not having children or men. So that's values once again in my world, right? It's not that inherently she is going to work less than the father, right? That's not based on her contribution. That's just based on our values and our assumptions about how much work the man and the woman are going to do at that point.
Well put. Question from Raccoon, I guess his name is. Regarding recruiting differently, some key decision makers may believe that non-traditional recruits are less likely to succeed in their roles compared to those recruited from more traditional sources, and their own experience may even further cement this belief. For example, some hiring managers may strongly prefer candidates from elite colleges. And so what could we do to help convince people that recruiting differently will be worth the effort?
So I'll start on this one. It starts from within, and I can tell you that it's an evolution. And you have to have leaders at the top that are committed to it. And recruiting differently there's so many facets to it, right? Like number one, it's not going just to the elite colleges to recruit, right? And sometimes, not even sometimes, oftentimes, all the time, like you're very capable people. Like I went to the University of Wyoming. I would have never gotten recruited by Deloitte coming out of college, and I'm doing all right. Right. So it's making sure that that organizations kind of open their aperture in terms of the places and spaces. And that's why I say, like, if you have aspirations to go to an organization that you think they only recruited an elite college, go apply, go find somebody. Like LinkedIn is your friend on this. Take the onus on yourself, because not every organization is there where they're kind of recruiting differently. Organizations also need to change the requirements that they kind of publish and live by, right? They think that there are absolute fundamental, you have to have X, Y, and Z. But now organizations are thinking, well, we can actually replace, 5 years of work experience with, a degree in X, Y, Z. Like there are trade-offs to be had that are very relevant. And frankly, there's a lot of things that you can learn. Like we all know this, there's a lot of things that you can learn in the workforce that you're not going to learn in the classroom. It doesn't negate the need for classroom and what you're in, like technical skills that you're going to get in there. But there needs to be a translation. I think about the commitments that are being made around 110. We're not going to be able to, as a society, achieve those commitments unless we think about hiring differently and creating opportunities. This is why returnships are really good. Let's give people a chance to come into an organization. Let's train them up. And it's a returnship because it's a chance for somebody to come back into the workforce, but it also gives them a chance to say, do I really want to work at this organization? Do they really live by these values? And at the same time, that organization is going to want to make sure that they set you up for success and put it in the right way. So there's so many steps along the way. And it also gets into like removing resume bias and having the right kind of interviewers in the room and treating, getting rid of unconscious bias and all of that. Like it is there's not a silver bullet to this, but all of these in concert will start to make change. That's why this incremental change is good. We just have to be committed to it.
When you bring them in, just as Kristi said, set them up for success, right? First of all, set up a system where they have a mentor, pay them equally, set up a mentor, and make sure they have the training and they have the resources to be successful. And do not bring 2 to 3 people of one demographic in and set them up as the tokens that are then responsible for the success of their entire group. Bring in a cohort. If you're going to start at an African-American college, bring in 10, 20, 30 people as a cohort with mentors, with fair pay, and then give them the training and the resources they need to be successful, and make sure that somebody is responsible for aiding them in that journey, knowing that there's no way that your firm has gone as far as it needs to give them equal opportunity, and that they will likely have more barriers than the Caucasian male employees that you hired at the same time, but have somebody be responsible or somebody there so that if they have a barrier, there's somebody that they can talk to without fear of reprisal, and that you can actually genuinely give them the chance of success.
Yeah, well, it makes me think of the work that University of Texas has done to help, they take the top, I guess it's 5 or 10% from all high schools. And a lot of those people come from high schools where they're less prepared, and they have great programs to level them up significantly, like within the first 3 or 4 months, just as you're talking, get their skill sets up. They're completely capable people. They just need that extra help. And, from my perspective, I saw a real change maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, leading companies really starting to become aware that if they keep going to the same places, they're going to keep getting the same people, and vastly broadening the schools that they go to recruit. So companies like Deloitte and Goldman Sachs and others they don't just go to the top 4 schools anymore. They're going to a big group of schools. So question from Hugo. Since religion is so tied to values, it is incredibly hard to change something of behaviors ingrained by religious upbringing. And indeed, I suppose most of the world's big wars have been fought over religion too. I assume it's also highly tied to family, Latin families at least. Therefore, raising awareness, advocating to these issues may feel like distancing oneself from family. How to promote and advocate while lessening a very likely pushback? How to behave in order to promote helpful discourse? I see so much pushback on agendas promoting fundamental changes, and it seems at times that a counterforce for status quo maintenance grows just as strong as the movements for change.
Yeah, I like your question. That's one of the reasons that I did that study in the laboratory experiment, right? So we showed that if we have religion alongside policies that force egalitarian values, it negated the effect of religion. So one example would be like a strict sexual harassment policy, not one of those silly policies that's in place and nobody's actually using it, but a policy where there's actually somebody that somebody could talk to if they were sexually harassed, and then enforce it. Keeping in mind that the pushback with this stuff, right? It's sexual harassment, what the literature tells us is it's about power. It's a way for putting people in their place and then maintaining power over them. So often the people who are doing it are, trying to show that they are in that dominant position. And if a firm really wants people to have equal opportunity to have success, you need to put the policies in place where they have equal chances. And related to you as a male, like things like that decision on whether, when you have the option of paternity leave, do you take the full 26 weeks? Do you take the 26 weeks and put down your work and get to the point where you know how to change the diapers and you say, you know what, this is equally my child. And at that point, when all the men step up and say, you know what, it is my kid as much as yours. I mean, we set the rule from day one that all poop patrol was my husband's job, right? I had to feed, poop patrol was his. And just that, even now at 6, if she needs somebody to wipe her butt or has a mess, she hollers for her father, right? And that egalitarian values in the household means that I can be equally successful. And now with COVID times, he can't leave the house. So before noon, she knows never to come for her mother, right? So just these simple values where you step up and say, you know what, I am going to equally participate in my household. I'm going to tell people that I equally participate. I'm going to stand up for people and ensure that men take parental leave, are all these steps, minor little, on an individual level, steps in the right direction. But if we all do this, we are going to nudge society to exactly where we want to be.
Yeah, well put. Kristi, you want to add to that?
No, it's perfect.
Yeah. Any last closing remarks? We're almost out of time. I'm thinking about nudges. You just talked about a bunch of great nudges, Traci. Are there any others that come to mind that you want to leave people with? No, for being allies and making change.
I think we should continue the conversation offline. I think we should post this stuff on our Facebook page and continue conversing with people and make sure that this conversation doesn't die today.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add, it is an evolution of the conversation. In fact, Josh asked a great question, should we include non-binary genders in this? And the answer is yes. We don't have data yet, but we continue to get smarter. We continue to get wiser. We also are getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that is actually what is going to start to make change. So just keep it coming.
Great. Well, Traci, we were honored that you're part of our faculty here and appreciate the really great work you're doing. And Kristi, thanks so much for the work you're doing, the important work you're doing, and for being such a great partner for the university and for other companies. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. Thanks for joining us today. I encourage you to join us for our other 3 business insights this year that are posted there. And recording this will be available after